Give the dictatorship of the proletariat a chance? What if we take the risk of resuscitating the good old dictatorship of the proletariat as the only way to break with biopolitics? This cannot but sound ridiculous today. It cannot but appear that these are two incompatible terms from different fields with no shared space. The latest analysis of political power versus archaic and discredited communist mythology. And yet, this is the only true choice today. The term proletarian dictatorship continues to point towards the key problem. A commonsensical reproach arises here. Why dictatorship? Why not true democracy or simply the power of the proletariat? The term proletarian dictatorship continues to point towards the crucial issue. Dictatorship does not mean the opposite of democracy, but democracy's own underlying mode of functioning. From the very beginning, the thesis on the dictatorship of the proletariat involved the presupposition that it is the opposite of other forms of dictatorship, since the entire field of state power is that of dictatorship. When Lenin designated liberal democracy as a form of bourgeois dictatorship, he did not imply a simplistic notion that democracy is really manipulated, a mere facade, that some secret clique is really in power and controls things, and that, if threatened with losing its power in democratic elections, it will show its true face and assume direct power. What he meant is that the very form of the bourgeois democratic state, the sovereignty of its power in its ideological political presuppositions, embodies a bourgeois logic. One should thus use the term dictatorship in the precise sense in which democracy is also a form of dictatorship, that is, as a purely formal determination. It is often pointed out that self-questioning is constitutive of democracy, that democracy always allows, solicits even, constant self-interrogation of its features. However, this self-referentiality has to stop at some point. Even the most free elections cannot put in question the legal procedures that legitimize and organize them, the state apparatuses that guarantee, by force if necessary, the electoral process, and so on. The state, in its institutional aspect, is a massive presence which cannot be accounted for in terms of the representation of interests. The democratic illusion is that it can. Badiou has conceptualized this excess as the excess of state representation over what it represents. One can also put it in Benjaminian terms. While democracy can more or less eliminate constituted violence, it still has to rely continuously on constitutive violence. Let us recall the lesson of Hegelian concrete universality. Imagine a philosophical debate between a hermeneuticist, a deconstructionist, and an analytic philosopher. What they sooner or later discover is that they do not simply occupy positions within a shared common space called philosophy. What distinguishes them is the very notion of what philosophy is as such. That is, an analytic philosopher perceives the global field of philosophy and the respective differences between the participants differently than a hermeneuticist. What is different between them are the differences themselves, which are what render their true differences, in the first approach, invisible. The gradual classificatory logic of this is what we share and here our differences begin breaks down. For the contemporary cognitivist analytic philosopher, with the cognitivist turn, philosophy has finally reached the maturity of serious reasoning, leaving behind metaphysical speculation. For a hermeneuticist, analytic philosophy is, on the contrary, the end of philosophy, the final loss of a truly philosophical stance, the transformation of philosophy into another positive science. So when the participants in the debate are struck by this more fundamental gap that separates them, they stumble upon the moment of dictatorship. And, in a homologous fashion, the same goes for political democracy. Its dictatorial dimension becomes palpable when the struggle turns into the struggle about the field of struggle itself. So what about the proletariat? Insofar as the proletariat designates the part of no part, which stands for universality, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the power of universality, where those who are the part of no part set the tone. Why are they egalitarian universalists? again for purely formal reasons, because as the part of no part, they lack the particular features that would legitimate their place within the social body. They belong to the set of society without belonging to any of its subsets. As such, their belonging is directly universal. Here, the logic of the representation of multiple particular interests and their mediation through compromises reaches its limit. Every dictatorship breaks with this logic of representation, which is why the simplistic definition of fascism as the dictatorship of finance capital is wrong. Marx already recognized that Napoleon III, that proto-fascist, broke with the logic of representation. The term dictatorship designates the hegemonic role in the political space, and the term proletariat, those out of joint in the social space, the part of no part, lacking their proper place within it. This is why the all-too-quick dismissal of the proletariat as the universal class misses the point. The proletariat is not the universal class in the same sense in which, for Hegel, the state bureaucracy was the universal class, directly standing for the universal interests of society, in contrast to other estates which stand for their particular interest. What qualifies the proletariat for this position is ultimately a negative feature. All other classes are potentially capable of reaching the status of the ruling class, while the proletariat cannot achieve this without abolishing itself as a class. What makes the working class into an agency and provides it with a mission is neither its poverty, nor its militant and pseudo-military organization, nor its proximity to the chiefly industrial means of production. It is only its structural inability to organize itself into yet another ruling class that provides the working class with such a mission. The proletariat is the only revolutionary class in history that abolishes itself in the act of abolishing its opposite. The people, on the other hand, made up of a myriad of classes and subclasses, social and economic strata, cannot structurally carry out such a mission. Quite on the contrary, whenever a historical task is assigned to the people as such, the outcome has always been that either a fetal bourgeoisie immediately took precedence and, through an accelerated growth process, organized itself into a ruling class, as in the case of national liberation movements, or a politico-ideological nucleus designated itself as a caretaker government for an indeterminate period, for the people, or more specifically, the working class, which unerringly ended up in empire, as it was in the case of Jacobins and Bolsheviks. There is thus more than hypocrisy in the fact that, at the highest point of Stalinism, when the entire social edifice was shattered by purges, the new constitution proclaimed the end of the class character of Soviet power. Voting rights were restored to members of classes previously excluded, and that the socialist regimes were called people's democracies. The opposition of the proletariat and the people is crucial here. In Hegelese, their opposition is the very opposition of true and false universality. The people is inclusive, the proletariat is exclusive. The people fights intruders, parasites, those who obstruct its full self-assertion. The proletariat fights a struggle which divides the people in its very core. The people wants to assert itself, the proletariat wants to abolish itself. One should thus thoroughly demystify the scarecrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat. At its most basic, it stands for the tremulous moment when the complex web of representations is suspended due to the direct intrusion of universality into the political field. With regard to the French Revolution, it was, significantly, Danton, not Robespierre, who provided the most concise formula for the imperceptible shift from the dictatorship of the proletariat to statist violence, or, in Benjamin's terms, from divine to mythic violence. Let us be terrible, so that the people will not have to be. For Danton, Jacobin revolutionary state terror was a kind of preemptive action, whose true aim was not to take revenge on its enemies, but to prevent the direct divine violence of the sans-culottes, of the people themselves. In other words, let us do what the people demand us to do, so that they will not do it themselves. From ancient Greece, we have a name for this intrusion: democracy. That is to say, what is democracy at its most elementary? a phenomenon which, for the first time, appeared in ancient Greece, when the members of the demos, those with no firmly determined place in the hierarchical social structure, not only demanded that their voice be heard against those in power, they not only protested the wrong they suffered and wanted their voice to be recognized and included in the public sphere, on an equal footing with the ruling oligarchy and aristocracy. Even more, they, the excluded, presented themselves as the embodiment of the whole of society, of true universality. We, the nothing, not counted in the order, are the people. We are all against others who stand only for their particular privileged interest. Political conflict proper designates the tension between the structured social body, in which each part has its place, and the part of no part, which unsettles this order on account of the empty principle of universality, of what Etienne Balibar calls égalité, the principled equality of all men qua speaking beings, up to and including the liumang, hoodlums in the China of today, those who are displaced and float freely hither and thither, without work or home, but also without cultural or sexual identities, and unregistered by the state. This identification of the part of society with no properly defined place within it, or which rejects the allocated subordinated place within it, with the whole, is the elementary gesture of politicization, discernible in all great democratic events, from the French Revolution, in which le troisième état proclaimed itself identical with the nation as such, against the aristocracy and clergy, to the demise of East European socialism, in which dissident fora proclaimed themselves representative of the entirety of society against the party nomenclatura. In this precise sense, politics and democracy are synonymous. The basic aim of anti-democratic politics, always and by definition, is and was depoliticization, the demand that things should return to normal, with each individual sticking to his or her particular job. And this brings us to the inevitable paradoxical conclusion. The dictatorship of the proletariat is another name for the violence of the democratic explosion itself. The dictatorship of the proletariat is thus the zero level at which the difference between legitimate and illegitimate state power is suspended. In other words, when state power as such is illegitimate. Saint-Just said in November 1792, "Every king is a rebel and an usurper." This phrase is a cornerstone of emancipatory politics. There is no legitimate king as opposed to the usurper, since being a king is in itself an usurpation, in the same sense that, for Proudhon, property as such is theft. What we have here is the Hegelian negation of the negation, the passage from the simple and direct negation, this king is not legitimate, he is a usurper, to the inherent self-negation. An authentic king is an oxymoron. Being a king is usurpation. This is why, for Robespierre, the trial of the king was not a trial at all. There is no trial to be held here. Louis is not a defendant. You are not judges. You cannot be anything but statesmen and representatives of the nation. You have no sentence to pronounce for or against a man, but a measure of public salvation to implement, an act of national providence to perform. Louis was king, and the Republic is founded. The famous question you are considering is settled by those words alone. Louis was dethroned by his crimes. Louis denounced the French people as rebellious. To chastise it, he called on the arms of his fellow tyrants. Victory in the people decided that he was the rebellious one. Therefore, Louis cannot be judged. Either he is already condemned, or the Republic is not acquitted. Proposing to put Louis on trial, in whatever way that could be done, would be to regress towards royal and constitutional despotism. It is a counter-revolutionary idea, for it means putting the revolution itself in contention. In fact, if Louis can still be put on trial, then he can be acquitted. He may be innocent. What am I saying? He is presumed to be so until he has been tried. But if Louis is acquitted, if Louis can be presumed innocent, what becomes of the revolution? This strange coupling of democracy and dictatorship is grounded in the tension that pertains to the very notion of democracy. There are two elementary and irreducible sides to democracy: violent egalitarian imposition by those who are supernumerary, and the regulated, more or less, universal procedure of choosing those who will exert power. How do these two sides relate to each other? What if democracy, in the second sense, the regulated procedure of registering the people's voice, is ultimately a defense against itself, against democracy in the sense of the violent intrusion of the egalitarian logic that disturbs the hierarchical functioning of the social system, and attempt to re-functionalize this excess, to make it a part of the normal running of things. The problem is thus how to regulate, institutionalize, the very violent egalitarian democratic impulse, how to prevent it from being drowned in democracy in the second sense of the term, regulated procedure. If there is no way to do it, then authentic democracy remains a momentary utopian outburst which, the proverbial morning after, has to be normalized. The Orwellian proposition, democracy is terror, is thus democracy's infinite judgment, its highest speculative identity. This dimension gets lost in Claude Lefort's notion of democracy as involving the empty place of power, the constitutive gap between the place of power and the contingent agents who, for a limited period, can occupy that place. Paradoxically, the underlying premise of democracy is thus not only that there is no political agent which has a natural right to power, but much more radically, that the people itself, the ultimate source of the sovereign power in democracy, does not exist in a substantial entity. In the Kantian conception, the democratic notion of the people is a negative concept, a concept whose function is merely to designate a certain limit. It prohibits any determinate agent from ruling with total sovereignty. The claim that the people does exist is the basic axiom of totalitarianism, and its mistake is strictly homologous to the Kantian misuse, paralogism, of political reason. The people exists through a determinate political agent, which acts as if it directly embodies, not only represents the people, its true will, the totalitarian party and its leader, that is, in the terms of transcendental critique, as a direct phenomenal embodiment of the noumenal people. Let us cite once again Jacques-Alain Miller's formulation of the link between this notion of democracy and Lacan's notion of the inconsistency of the big other. Is democracy a master signifier? Without any doubt. It is the master signifier which says that there is no master signifier, at least not a master signifier which would stand alone, that every master signifier has to insert itself wisely among others. Democracy is Lacan's big S of the barred A, which says, I am the signifier of the fact that the other has a whole, or that it doesn't exist. Of course, Miller is aware that every master signifier bears witness to the fact that there is no master signifier, no other of the other, that there is a lack in the other, and so on. The very gap between S1 and S2 occurs because of this lack. As with God in Spinoza, the master signifier by definition fills in the gap in the series of ordinary signifiers. The difference is that with democracy, this lack is directly inscribed into the social structure. It is institutionalized in a set of procedures and regulations. No wonder, then, that Miller approvingly quotes Marcel Gauchet regarding how, in democracy, truth only offers itself in division and decomposition. And one cannot but note with irony how Stalin and Mao made the same claim, although with a totalitarian twist. In politics, truth only emerges through the ruthless divisions of the class struggle. It is easy to note how, from within this Kantian horizon of democracy, the terroristic aspect of democracy can only appear as its totalitarian distortion. In other words, how, within this horizon, the line that separates the authentic democratic explosion of revolutionary terror from the totalitarian party-state regime, or to put it in reactionary terms, the line that separates the mob rule of the dispossessed from the party-state's brutal oppression of the mob, is obliterated. It is against this background that one can formulate a critique of Jacques Rancière's political aesthetics, of his idea of the aesthetic dimension of the properly political act. A democratic explosion reconfigures the established hierarchical police order of social space. It stages a spectacle of a different order, of a different partage of the public space. Peter Hallward is right to point out that, in today's society of the spectacle, such an aesthetic reconfiguration has lost its subversive dimension. It can easily be appropriated into the existing order. The true task lies not in momentary democratic explosions which undermine the established police order, but in the dimension designated by Badiou as that of fidelity to the event, inscribing the democratic explosion into the positive police order, imposing on social reality a new, lasting order. This is the properly terroristic dimension of every authentic democratic explosion, the brutal imposition of a new order. And this is why, while everybody loves democratic rebellions, the spectacular, carnivalesque explosions of the popular will, anxiety arises when this will wants to persist, to institutionalize itself. And the more authentic the rebellion, the more terroristic is this institutionalization. The standard liberal counterargument to those who warn about the invisible hand of the market that controls our destinies is, if the price of being freed from the invisible hand of the market is to be controlled by the visible hand of new rulers, are we still ready to pay it? The answer should be yes. If this visible hand is visible to and controlled by the part of no part.